the web recorded and will be available on NUS Connect afterwards with a circular link, so please do share it with any colleagues who couldn't come along today. So next, I'm going to present first of all on what's happening, so if you could all mute yourselves, that would be great, most of you have. We're going to attempt to have a discussion session. Because obviously we're over the web and can't see each other, I'm going to ask if you want to speak, let me know in the chat box and then I can unmute you and we can try and speak one at a time. But obviously it's a bit clunky, but there'll be a lot more discussion at SU's local. We're going to all the SU's locals and at HE zones, so there's plenty of opportunity to chat with us and with each other about the proposed changes. So let's get going. In terms of so all 4 UK HE funding councils have been reviewing the provision of information in HE for about 2 years now. It's overseen by a group called HEPISC, which stands for the Higher Education Public Information Steering Group. It's by Janet Beer, the Vice Chancellor of Liverpool, and NUS has a seat, so Sarana sits on this board of NUS staff. The NSS, in July 2014, there was an extensive literature review and consultation published, which NUS contributed to and a lot of students' unions did as well. And that contained a number of recommendations, which are being tested out through cognitive testing and a pilot survey this year. This consultation that's being launched now is the result of those cognitive testing and pilots and makes a number of recommendations within it. So they're published last week. Consultation remains open until the 4th of December, and we would really encourage all student unions to contribute to the whole of the consultation, so not just question 23. There are some other exciting changes being proposed that it will be student unions' views on. So the key recommendations for each area. So obviously we'll be focusing mostly on the NSS today, but there are some key recommendations around Unistats, which is the site for prospective students. So they're going to maintain a website. It may or may not be called Unistats. Holds information about courses and institutions aimed at prospective students. They're looking at rebranding it though. So it may not be Unistats, it may not be the information set, but they want to bring it together under one stronger brand apparently. To redesign Unistats so that it gives the information they need at the time they need it. And also they're looking at how they can make it more accessible to diverse students, so particularly focusing on the information needs of part-time students, students, and without a family background of higher education. The proposals also say that the information that's currently included in the key information set on learning, teaching and assessment is going to be moved to institutions' websites. So this is stuff like the amount of time spent on independent study versus in class and that kind of thing. Because the feedback has been that a centralised comparable website doesn't give you the context that you need to truly understand what teaching and learning will look like at that institution. So that's proposed to move to institutions' own websites and be governed by guidance that fits in with the Competition and Markets Authority guidance on the provision of information. So there's more about that in the consultation. In terms of the information published by institutions, there's going to be kind of beefed up guidance about what is expected of institutions. A notable win there is that it explicitly states additional course costs should be published on institutions' websites. And they're also going to work to develop good practice and share it around. So hopefully the removal of the information from the key information set and Unistats doesn't mean information won't be there and should be governed by strict rules. NSS. So this is copied and pasted directly from the executive summary of the report itself. So the main points as the funding council see it. So one is applying criteria for questions in the main survey. So previously there weren't formal criteria that questions had to meet to be included in the survey, but it's proposed that there will be, and there's 8 of them. Recommendation is including new questions on student engagement. So it's proposed there's going to be 9 new questions on student engagement, which is potentially exciting. And questions on learning resources and assessment and feedback, and those are really kind of minor wording changes, but I'll go through them in a minute. Looking at merging questions that correlate really highly with each other, that suggest they're asking the same things. And it goes off in a little bit. It's proposed that the personal development questions and the students' union question, so question 23, would move out of the core survey and into the optional banks. So this means that they wouldn't be published, it would be internal data only. But again, I'll come back to what this might mean later on. They're also doing a review of the optional banks of questions that you can add on to the end of the survey to see if there should be any new ones, any perhaps exciting categories of theme that we might want to ask questions about. So that's what's happening. I'll go into a bit more detail now. The review looks at what would happen post 2017. So all the recommendations so far for Unistats, for institutions' websites, and the NSS are implemented in 2017. The last section of the review looks at kind of 2017, what might we want to look into. So it's much less concrete and much more kind of consider. So they want to consider how qualitative information could be published. So potentially publishing NSS comments or something similar is going to be explored. Looking at ways of gathering feedback from students who aren't covered by the NSS, so particularly students on short courses, but also students who drop out of their course before the end, looking at ways they can get their feedback, because obviously the people who complete the course to the end and then to the NSS are a subset of all the students. It's important to try and make we've got all the views that we should have. And finally, despite being considered only 2 years ago, it's back on the agenda. We need a postgrad NSS. So that is another proposal that they're asking questions on in the consultation. Into a bit more depth on the recommendations in the NSS review for you. Some questions. They're proposing 9 new questions. They take a definition of student engagement as engagement in their learning with the classroom, but also a sense of belonging to the institution. The 3 new potential banks, which may or may not be sections in their own right, they may appear in other parts of the survey. So the first one is academic challenge and integrative learning. So it's stuff like, course has challenged me to do my best work, and that kind of thing. About the learning community and collaborative learning, so interaction with peers, but also feeling part of the university community. And which may be of specific interest to students' unions, the student voice. It's very much focused at a course level, but it's looking at whether there have been enough opportunities to give feedback on the course and whether their feedback has been taken on board. So that's a potentially exciting development. Introducing these student engagement questions is to explicitly recognise that the NSS is currently used for the enhancement of teaching and learning, and to try and actively do that. So that's the rationale. Of 9 new questions are being introduced, that means other things will be taken out. So I'll talk about what they are shortly. Into the minor wording changes for the learning resources and feedback questions, they're really just tinkering. So learning resources questions, they've shifted the language a bit to make it more up to date when they're talking about online resources. And it focuses on whether resources have helped support the learning of students rather than just satisfaction with them. Feedback questions, instead of feedback, we're asking about timely feedback, and instead of detailed feedback, we're looking for detailed comments, we're looking for helpful comments. Changes there. So are here. So the ones in green are proposed to stay, and the ones in red are proposed to go. So staff have made the subject interesting, and staff are enthusiastic about what they're teaching, strongly correlate, and it suggests that students are answering the same question, essentially. So they propose getting rid of 3. Marking and assessment have been set, and the criteria used in marking have been clear in advance. All correlate, and it suggested that the criteria being clear in advance is a key and important part of marking and assessment being fair. Another one was removing the question on feedback on my work has helped me clarify things I didn't understand, because it links so closely with particularly the reworded version of I've received helpful comments on my work. They propose to remove altogether. Okay, that's the technical proposals that have happened so far, excluding question 23. We've separated out into well, rest of the webinar will be about question 23. So in the chat, could you let me know if you have any questions on any of the proposed changes so far? And Chris Taylor, who is also here. may attempt to answer them. Okay, half a question from you there. There we go. So, if the student engagement questions being proposed are similar to the questions being asked in the Student Satisfaction and Engagement Survey in Scottish colleges. That survey, I will be honest straight up, but I can tell you the questions that are being proposed. Where did I put it? Actually, because I've not got the document open, apologies. But if you do read the consultation document, it will show you the wording of the proposed questions. So you'll be able to have a look at those and see if they are similar to the Scottish Colleges questionnaires. Ben has said, is concerned about the removal of the last feedback question. We don't want to lose a question that focuses on the impact of feedback. Helpful is a bit woolly. Okay. As I'm not receiving any more questions, I'll move on to discussing 23. So, the Students' Union question are proposing that they're going to remove it from the core questionnaire, and I'll come on to why that is. They propose that NUS work with the funding councils to develop an optional bank of questions on the Students' Union. So this is quite a win. It's proposed that all optional banks are jointly agreed between the institution and the Students' Union, which is quite a strengthening of existing guidance, which only says that institutions are meant to consult. So Students' Unions will have joint sign-off on the selection of optional bank questions if this recommendation goes forward. So background, the agreement that NUS has had with the Students' Union question in the NSS has been extensive. We've been doing a lot of work with the fund councils and with the cognitive testing companies to test out different versions of the question. So when it was announced that the reviewed a couple of years ago, we did an initial blue eyes consultation with Students' Unions in autumn 2013, and we got quite clear feedback from that unions are happy with the current wording of question 23. So because we got this quite strong feedback, we then ran a specific consultation in spring 2014 where we tested 4 alternative questions that had different formats and different focuses. The most popular question out of those was a matrix-style question, which looked at different services provided by the union. Unfortunately, that one doesn't fit with the format of the NSS, and it was ruled out automatically. But the second most popular question looked at student core purpose of representation. So that's the angle that we took going forward. So we continued to consult throughout late 2014, early 2015 at pretty much every staff and officer-facing event that we could go to make sure we were continuing to have the conversations and to make sure that we were saying what the members wanted. So all this consultation gives us an idea that people want a core question. They did want one, and they found the question Students' Union being published really valuable, but they wanted it to focus on representation. Several alternatives for testing. I worked with the funding councils and with the cognitive testers to make sure they really understood what we're about and so what it meant when we were talking about academic representation. So they were asking students what they were thinking when they were filling in the questionnaire. They knew whether they were on the right track or not. Throughout the entire process, both with members and with the funding councils, to try and to make it more appropriate for Students' Unions. The questions didn't test particularly well. The reasons why question 23 is being proposed for removal, the first one is that the 8 new criteria I spoke about earlier include one on all questions must concern the academic experience and especially learning and teaching. So obviously question 23 as it is now doesn't meet that criterion, and the funding councils were willing to work with us to create a question that did, because that all chimed with the idea that we wanted to ask a question about representation. We tested them. We tested quite a few different variations of them, but unfortunately students didn't associate the Students' Union with academic life, which would be an interesting thing to know in and of itself, Unfortunately, it meant that their answers to questions didn't match the intention of the question. So some of them were saying, I associate the Students' Union with my academic life, but the bar's good, so I'll rate it well. Or some of them were saying, I don't associate the Students' Union with my academic life, so I'm going to score it really poorly. It was basically giving really poor data, which is really unfortunate. A final reason for the funding councils, at least, is that when they were researching with prospective students what they want to know before they apply for university or college, they don't view the Students' Union as a priority, and when they do, they're looking at its social role rather than academic role, which obviously doesn't fit in with the purpose of the NSS, which is a learning and teaching survey. So what this would mean for students' unions if it does go forward, there'd no longer be a push score for students' unions in the NSS or in the information set. This would mean next year would be the last year of having a students' union question. There would indeed have more questions, perhaps up to 5 students' unions in an optional bank, so it can give you more granular information than the really broad question at the moment. But our banks aren't published, and they take a lower response rate than the core questions. Questions that we would need to have, conversations with the funding councils about sharing between unions. So because it's not published, it will be up to unions and institutions to share data collaboratively amongst themselves if they wanted to. But that will be a conversation that we have to make sure that we have so that we can continue to use these optional options to improve students' unions' practice. Now I've done a summary of where we are and what's happening. I've got some questions, but I'd like to throw it open to a discussion to you guys really. So think about what the impact of removing question 23 on your union, and what types of questions would be helpful to include in an optional bank, do you think? And would you share your data with other unions? Would you share it with NUS? If you'd like to speak, please indicate in the chat and then I can unmute you. This works. If you don't, feel free to type a question. Okay, so it's definitely like a question on representation in the optional bank. Did some primary testing on potential bank questions to see if, when placed in context, a question about the academic experience or representation would be interpreted better, and it was. So when they answered questions about various other aspects of the union, then focus on representation when they're asked about it. So that could work. Okay, I just said that a question on union welfare services would be very useful. So there's been a couple of ways we could go with the optional banks. We could go with asking about services specifically. Obviously, we run into difficulty when certain unions don't offer certain services, but there may be a chance to opt in and out of certain questions, perhaps. Or we go down the road of looking at the purposes of the union, so looking at representation, development, and that kind of thing. Okay, the SUI question on impact is important and should be shared. Happy to share our data. Yep, there's a problem. So Lydia says the optional banks aren't published. We can't benchmark against other students' unions. So we can't if we're top, middle, or bottom across the country. That is a problem with moving into the optional banks. How we would look to speak with the funding councils and organise an arrangement where if unions want to share data, they can share data. We could still use the question for enhancement.
The point, if I've understood it right, Kate, is that when it's not published, what that means is it's not published as a matter of course. There's the option that unions, institutions, NUS could arrange or agree separately to do that kind of collectively together.
Yes. Conversations that we've actually started having when we were scoping this out with the councils, and they seem potentially receptive rather than no, you just definitely can't share your data. So it's definitely a conversation they're up for
on the point, if I may, Kate, about kind of comparisons around the country. I think some of the funding bodies kind of notes of caution on doing institution by institution comparison at that top level, because although obviously active in some ways, you need to be really careful with, because student demographics are different, there's a different particular context and situations are different. So the reliability of those comparisons, even in the main question not related to students' unions, is even the funding bodies themselves would say is problematic at best.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, questions coming in now, so I'll try and address them in a rough order. Okay, from Lewis, what aspects of the union they asked about when it was shown representation tested better? So these were questions that we developed through our consultation at various events over the last year, and it was focused on other purposes of students' union. So it was something like, from memory, so not an exact quote, but something like, the students' union has had a positive impact on my sense of belonging, on my personal development and growth, on my engagement with the wider community, that kind of thing. So after those questions, which they actually did understand quite well, understood the representation question a lot better, because they saw it as an aspect of the union at that point. A long comment here. Okay. Lack of a link between the SU and academic experience. We definitely this seen as irrelevant, so interested in this. Do you see the SU as a factor when choosing the university? Okay. So yeah, interview testing with students. They ask students what they're thinking about when they answer the question and why they've answered the way they have. A lot of them were ignoring the part of the question that was about the academic experience or about representation, and were only answering based on their perceptions of the union as a whole, which was mostly about its social role, the bar and clubs and societies and that kind of thing. Students also, when asked, didn't see the student union as a factor when what and where to study. They think it was useful to have one, but they didn't particularly want to know about it, and they only thought it was a social thing, so they're thinking that it does bars and clubs, that kind of thing. Interestingly, question 23 was introduced based on ABE research that gave students a list of things that could be given to them as information before they apply, and the students' union was on the list, and they picked it out as an important thing, but subsequently we found out that it's not a priority when they're choosing where to go to study. Will council still hold data? If so, are they sole decision makers on how or if it is shared? This is not sure on at the moment. So funding councils, yes, will still own the data, but we are having conversations, and we will continue to have conversations with them about the fact that we want to use this data for enhancement purposes, and it needs to be shared for that to happen. They would probably not publish it. They won't publish it, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't share data amongst ourselves. I say on the core purpose of SUs and the ways in which SUs enhance students' experiences, either through representation, personal development, or support. Yes, great. Okay. If no banks, would that also mean that we couldn't look deeper into the data? TechSoon's website this year didn't allow custom reports on optional questions. That's a really interesting point, actually. There's no reason why we couldn't talk to the funding councils and to TechSoon to see if we would be able to do this kind of analysis on those questions. Obviously, it would depend on what the rate was, because fewer people fill in questions. But if it meets the threshold, I don't see why we couldn't ask for that to be a functionality of the website. Margaret, not how you'd word it, there's something about the impact of union membership on your overall experience. Happy to data with other unions. Great stuff. I'd like some questions which would be specific to us here about some of our services, which would share, so that we share the impact question. Okay, interesting, thank you. Okay, Ed, ooh, this is a big comment. One thing to do would be if students who choose to complete the optional bank on their union may well be those students who are already actively engaged with unions or those with issues against the union. It would make the picture unrepresentative. Having said, I agree the current question doesn't give much of an insight into their thinking to start with.
The optional banks, they're optional insofar as the institution and the student union decide whether they're included. But when they are the student, they just appear as they just appear as the section on from the NSS. How it appears to the students.
Yeah, they're at the end. So there is drop off. Not a huge amount of drop off generally, right, but there is some drop off. But yeah, it seems to be the next question rather than it seeming to be something additional. So
don't get to pick and choose when they're asked the question.
No.
It's just that some of them don't make their way to the end of those ones.
Yes, that's right. Questions. Reese, universities are doing more themselves around student engagement and student voice through employing staff teams. Could removing question 23 as a core question that established impact on the leverage that students' unions have over the university and recognising students' unions as the primary voice of students?
That's fine. This is a question about essentially the potential power that schools in 23 have to influence over institutions and its removal, lessening that power and leverage.
Yeah, the addition of student engagement questions in the core thing. I think it's a good point, and I think that students' unions have to, students' unions should strongly make the case that they are contributing to the student engagement questions as well as the institution.
Anyway, I guess that 123 can be beneficial in terms of making cases to your institution. It can work the other way. Well, I mean, I've only been at NSS at NUS for a few months. I'm already aware of 2 or 3 cases. The union has been kind of basically by the institution for allegedly dragging institution scores down. So it's the problem making cases is essentially based on what has been proven to basically be a flawed question. So it may help us in the short term, but kind of persisting to make cases and it just leverage with something that fundamentally down probably doesn't really work. It's a great place for us to be.
Yeah, I agree. Could it ask about services the union provides but students might not associate with the union, such as asking about course reps? Yeah, definitely. Obviously, you then run into issues where we'd have to test whether people were answering the question because they'd not heard of course reps or because they didn't know the students' union was involved with course reps. Obviously, whichever questions we do get will be thoroughly tested to make sure that we're really getting the answers to the ones that we're asking. And there's loads here. Okay, Ian, questions related to core role on sense of student community, peer-to-peer support, etc. Great. Yeah. Okay, Abby, is put a few questions into a separate bank going to withdraw from the fact that unions are supposed to be a representative body and focus more on services and the social side? But that was the rationale for the optional bank questions that we kind of tentatively put in for testing. We focused more on purposes and values rather than services to try and overcome that hurdle. But we would welcome feedback on whether you think that's the right approach. Lydia, we use question 23 for internal improvements, e.g. low satisfaction courses are high priorities for targeted work. Yeah. We worried about getting less responses in optional bank as we couldn't target our work so specifically if they're all making the optional banks into the core survey. Chris?
I guess I was nodding mainly. I mean, in terms of the use of question 23 and use of data, generate kind of use for internal enhancement purposes, most beneficial uses of it because you know that you're at least comparing like with like if you're looking at year on year between, because it's broadly speaking similar student demographics and situations, so it does make sense. I mean, I think getting to the point where we've got quite high levels of agreement, both with some of the funding councils about sharing of data with SEs who voluntarily then share that data into the system so that we can develop decent, robust bank of information that can be used for those purposes. When it comes to just using your own data, though, you've signed off what the optional banks are going to be with your institution. even in the absolute worst case scenario where you haven't got other institutions to compare it with, you have your own year-on-year data if you ask that optional bank each year. So you still, even the absolute worst case scenario of just you and your institution having that data, you should be able to compare year-on-year and look about how and where to target things. In terms of response rates, that is an issue with the optional bank, and I guess it will be something that the unions will need to reflect on in terms of all the work that I know all the huge amount of work that a lot of unions already do in terms of voting, filling the NSS in, and make sure that people get the end of it, I guess.
Yeah, we can do in terms of we can look at the interface of the survey, how it appears to students, so we can see if there's a way to make it a smooth transition between the end of the core survey and the start of the optional survey. In terms of your specific question, Lydia, on is there a way of making the optional banks into the core survey? Unfortunately not. They want to lengthen the survey because it gets a high response rate because it's reasonably short. So particularly with the addition of 9 new questions on student engagement, realistically we're not going to get 5 questions on the Students' Union in the core survey, sadly. But we do the best we can with the optional banks, and hopefully they can be useful. Steve, a question whether they consider themselves to be a member of the Students' Union would be really interesting. Also, whether they feel the Students' Union represents me personally. And that we actually had with us when we were talking about how to phrase the question. And they were quite in favour of the Students' Union represents students' views or has an impact on students' experiences, rather than the kind of individualistic focus on Asian. But it'd be interesting to test responses to both, kind of going, does it represent me, does it represent students, and see if they're different. That would be interesting. Hannah, I've got a comment from you that I think was in response to something I said, but because I'm receiving it in kind of a timeline form, I'm not sure what you mean. So if you want to write the question, that would be really helpful. Okay. In question 23 will have an impact on SU marketing, perhaps less of a need to differentiate in some of the shared services. Lewis, do institutions have a limit on how many optional bank questions they can have? I think they do. At the moment, it's 6 optional banks. The survey pretty much double in length. So obviously, the more questions you have, the more response rate will tail off. But with HEFCE's assurance that students' unions will now jointly sign off optional banks are selected with the institution, that students' unions the power to say, well, if we want students' unions, we're going to get it. It could be investigated. We say if they choose the students' union block, it automatically goes first. Perhaps that's conversations that we could have too. Will there ever be a boy born who can swim faster than a shark? Thank you.
Yeah, there will.
On that one.
Confident.
I've reached the end of my list of questions that you sent me. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to ask or say? Anything like that?
Would it be someone asked earlier on about areas that are going to be asked around student engagement? Would that be helpful to just quickly go through? So some questions on student engagement are these the ones that are out for consultation, included in a revised NSS. So there are questions on, so a section of questions on academic challenge / reflective and integrative learning. Questions that are out for consultation. There are 4. So the course has challenged me to achieve my best, to think about the course content in greater depth, apply what I have learnt to practical problems or new situations. My course brings information and ideas together from different topics to solve problems.
These will probably sound quite familiar to those of you who know anything about the NSE, the American National Student Survey, the National Survey of Student Engagement. A lot of those types of questions are in there.
Interesting reflections on this for me is that they will have potentially quite an impact on pedagogy and how programs are delivered within institutions, particularly if you think about questions that ask things like encouraging application of learning to practical problems. So obviously things where it is predominantly practical applied, that's not an issue. in many other disciplines, this will be a thing, as it were. And the next section after this is about learning, community and collaborative learning. The questions that are being looked at there are and it's interesting, some of them are phrased as negatives, whereas some are phrased as positives, which is to do with survey structure.
This is a slightly out-of-date document. They decided not to make any comments worded.
Okay, so the three they're looking at there are things like, I feel part of a group of students and staff committed to learning, encouraged to talk about academic ideas with other students, and I've had opportunities to work with other students on my course. And then student voice is like staff appear to value the course feedback given by students. I'm aware about how students' comments on the course have been acted on. I've had opportunities to provide feedback on the course, and on this course, student ideas for improvement are taken seriously.
Yeah, several questions about whether we can send out these questions. They're only included in the consultation document, which I'm going to flash up a link to imminently, but there's also a link to it in our briefing that we circulated 2 weeks ago. So they're all in there. Have other questions? I'll just scroll up. This presentation is available for us to download. It will be, yes, it will be recorded and put on YouTube, and we'll circulate the link. You said something about when question 23 was included, research showed that unions were part of the decision making. Do you know 9 grand fees and the focus on employability and engagement has resulted in unions not being a high priority when deciding they want to go? I'm not. Yes.
Evidence to suggest that. And one of the things that's important reflecting on about the research that Kate's referred to, which was the Oakley and Staffordshire, was conducted by Heskey a number of years back now, was that whilst that was of work, the methodology was based around putting in front of students a list of existing information. Explanation was, and so would you find that useful? Is glib summary of the research. As an approach, that's fine, but the criticism that rightly followed was that it tends to lead students to kind of affirm what they see in front of them. So if they're presented with a list of information and they explain what it is, then they'll see that it's interesting. So there's a bit of a question mark over that. Whereas if you just ask a student without putting a list of information in front of them, what information would you be helpful, then stuff on SUs doesn't come up so much. So for me, it's something really interesting there about how NSS and student unions communicate to people before they're into higher education, about what a student union is, what it does, what they can expect from it. Yeah, answer there, but yeah, that's the thing I took from that.
I mean, I've not looked in depth at the research, but I imagine that students would still value the services and the opportunities that student unions provide without necessarily explicitly linking them to the students' union. They're asked about them, so they will want, I'm sure they will want social opportunities, sporting opportunities, chances to collaborate, get together, join societies, that kind of thing. It just might be that they're not directly linking that with the union.
Yeah, they just don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm at a very anecdotal level. If we were all to look back at the sort of 16, 17, I'm not sure I would be able to have told what a student union does, really, in broad terms.
Yeah. Okay. Jess, the first person to publicly post a question. Congratulations, Jess. Will the optional banker questions continue on from the rest of the survey, or will there be a break in between? That's something that we can talk with TechSooner and the funding councils about, and try and make that a bit more seamless so that students are encouraged to carry on filling it out. I'm not quite sure at the moment how it appears, but we can certainly do some work to try and make that clear. Okay, Lucy, would general questions be phrased as statements to agree with, as question 23 currently is? And would the answer range be the same? I guess one answers the other. We tested our preliminary optional bank, raised very much which union has had a positive impact on, so that it fit with the current Likert scale, strongly agree to strongly disagree. The feedback came back that we should consider a different answer scale for that, which would be you ask them, you get you ask them an actual question. So we submitted statements like X has had a positive impact on, and we phrased it into questions such as, to what has the Students' Union had a positive impact on X. And the answer scale would run from very, very positive impact to very negative impact. So that was something that was trialled and certainly is a possibility, but we just don't know what the questions are going to look like yet. We're very much at the formative stage. Those things are all up for grabs, really. And I just these questions via email. Yeah, they're in the consultation document, which it would be helpful to give you the link to. The link to the consultation document is on your screen. It's also in our briefing that we sent out last week. So if you go on NUS Connect to resources and click education, you'll find all the NSS stuff in there. Respond to the consultation. For a Students' Union, the Students' Unions we can get contributing, obviously, the best will end up being for Students' Unions, hopefully. Consultation closes on the 4th of December. Any thoughts or questions, or any colleagues have any comments or anything after this webinar that you want to share with NUS to do, you can either email me directly, or we've got a generic inbox which is nss@nus.org.uk. Does anyone have questions? Well, if you think of anything, do get in touch with me. But yeah, coming along today, please do share the recording with colleagues when you get it, and hopefully see you all at Zones and SUs Local to carry on talking about it.